investing in property makes sense. Investing in the right property takes knowledge. Welcome to the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. I'm Jarrod McCabe, Director of Wakeland Property Advisory. Join me for expert insights into the fundamentals, trends and opportunities to help you create long-term wealth through smart property decisions. Hi everyone and welcome to episode 40 of the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. So over the years, as a business, we've always spoken about wanting to build equity in a property. It enables you to further improve that property. It enables you to purchase other investment properties and to continue to build wealth down that path as well, perhaps to upgrade your home or even to invest in other asset classes. So thought today that we'd have a bit of a look at equity and some of the ways to build it. But first off, what is equity? Well, put simply, the equity in your property is the difference between its market value and your remaining home loan or debt that you've got against that property. So, for instance, if you've got a property that's worth $1 million and you've got a debt of $400,000 against that property, then you've got equity of $600,000. So there are a number of ways that we can go about building equity, but clearly the two main options that you've got are to reduce the debt, so to pay down the loan, or it's to increase the value of the property. So you can do that in a number of ways, and that's what we're going to look at today in terms of options and alternates to build equity in your property. So first off, we'll look at the capital growth. So that is really driven by asset selection. So the best capital growth focused assets are what you need to focus on as part of building equity. And it's a very different approach, as we've always said, to purchasing a home. When you're looking at buying a capital growth focused asset, you're not so much worried about the lifestyle characteristics that you would have focused on when buying a home. You're looking at what's going to drive that growth for that property into the future to help you build that equity. So as we've always said, there's three main drivers for that, three main elements. First one being having a property that's got strong underlying land value. So you need to be looking at properties in areas where land is at an absolute premium, so it's not readily available, and that there's high demand for property or for land in those locations as well, because that high demand will keep pressure on that lack of supply and can keep pushing prices up. The second is having something with scarcity to it. So properties that are not being replicated and having more and more of the same thing being built. So they're a finite asset class as opposed to an infinite asset class, which falls more in that off-the-plan apartment or in some of the outer modern estates that are being constructed. And there's a key difference. So people talk about, this property being rare or hard to come by. You've got to understand the difference between anomalous, which is what some of these rare properties might be, and a scarce property. An anomalous property is usually something that is quite unusual. It's quite often limited, and the demand is quite often limited too. So something, say, for instance, a one-bedroom house, where most people are looking for at least 2 or 3, perhaps 4 or 5 bedrooms. So a one-bedroom house could be considered anomalous, whereas a scarce property is something that's not being built. And typically a scarce property is wanted by more buyers than there are properties available. So a good example of that is a single-fronted cottage house or single-fronted terrace, because there's not any more of them being built. They're 100 plus years old, but they're in really high demand type locations. And then the final element here is having a property that's got multifaceted demand. So it's not reliant on one buyer profile. By having that and by having multiple buyer profiles interested in a property, obviously that increases your demand levels. So if the market does have a downturn and perhaps 1 or 2 of those buyer profiles leave the market or are reduced, then the others will hopefully take up the slack. So you tend to find with this type of element, it reduces the inconsistency. You've got a far more consistent growth pattern. So when we talk about these different buyer profiles, we're talking about, say, first home buyers. We might be talking about upgraders, so someone coming from a smaller home into a larger one. Downsizers, which is obviously the reverse, where someone's perhaps the family has moved out of home and there's only 2 people living, so they don't necessarily need the size of the family residence. Someone might be looking for a town base, so they perhaps have got the main residence now in a tree change or sea change location, but still looking to have a presence in the city. And then obviously finally the investor market as well. So if you can cover off on as many of those as possible, it's going to increase your demand levels going forward. The next element in terms of, or next option in terms of building equity is adding value to the property itself. So this element is far less reliant on market movement, and the focus is much more on improving the property itself to increase value. And it can be done in a variety of ways. Now, the most common and the most obvious are probably renovation, and that's generally focused on, say, kitchens and bathrooms, because those service areas have the greatest impact on value. But it can be as minimal as doing upgrading floor covering, so carpet, tiles, floorboard, giving floorboards a polish, painting throughout, or even light fittings or tap fittings in bathrooms. And you can really modernise properties with limited cost or expense if you know where to look and you know where you're going to get bang for buck. The next step from that is to do extensions. Now, it's obviously a more significant cost and certainly far more expensive. And the risk there too is that it can obviously increase your loan as well as the value of the property. So if that's the case, you can quite often cancel one another out and you're not actually building any equity in the property. So you do need to be smart about doing extensions, and you tend to find that it's probably more of a lifestyle decision than it is rather an option to build equity and to help you out with creating wealth. So it's something that you need to be careful around. And the other element to that, people talk about over-capitalising, and with extensions, it can be. It might only be an overcapitalisation in the short term. In the long term, it still works very favourably, but it may not necessarily be the best way to do things from a creating equity perspective. Landscaping to properties can be really beneficial as well. Again, it can be costly, so you need to be mindful of that. But improving outdoor entertaining areas, particularly low maintenance type properties, if you can reduce those maintenance levels as an investor, and it's one less thing for a renter to have to look after, that can be of great benefit to the renter, because they don't necessarily want to have to look after gardens, but it also means that there's less likely that they may impact or negatively impact on the value of your property as well. So it can be a really smart way to add value, but you do need to be mindful of costs. Moving a little bit more left of centre, perhaps if there's opportunities to create car accommodation. So again, with terrace houses and things, not all of them have got roller doors at the rear. So you may be able to, depending upon how low or high the laneway sits, you may be able to create off-street parking. And in a lot of inner city areas, that can be of great added value. But it may not necessarily be creating car accommodation. It may actually be enclosing off-street parking on a family home. So you may only have a driveway or just a space for off-street parking. By putting in a carport or a garage, particularly if that's something that is desirable for buyers in that area, that can certainly increase equity in your home doing that as well. Looking at the apartment market, you can find that we know that there's three forms of title with apartments, and the older two forms being company share and stratum. They can be quite difficult to borrow against. So modernising those titles into a strata can really increase the equity in your property there, because you can significantly increase the value, because you are increasing the number of buyers that are able to purchase your property. If you've got a company share or a stratum, certain buyers, particularly first home buyers, may not be able to borrow as much to buy that property, and therefore may look at alternates. So if you can create or convert your property into a strata, then that can certainly build equity that way as well. Subdivision, that's another option in terms of creating wealth, and it can be if you've got a larger property that perhaps could be subdivided, so focusing on a developer. Whether you do the subdivision or not, or whether you get plans drawn up, that could be an option. And on the flip side, the reverse of that, if you're in an apartment block, you might be able to come together and sell as a whole, which could very well, as land values continue to increase, mean that you can sell for a greater price and create equity that way as well by selling down. And then finally, rezoning can be another great way to increase value. Now, it's not an easy thing to do, and generally you've got to have some knowledge, but it's something, say, in some of the inner city suburbs of Melbourne, whereby there's formerly been a lot of light industrial, which is no longer considered to be the highest and best value for those, highest and best use for those properties. And what that can mean, if you can have the property rezoned from that light industrial use to a residential use, that can significantly increase the value, because it's one less thing that a developer might need to do themselves as part of a process. So, and most people have no doubt heard of some of the green wedge and the rural zonings out in some of more regional areas that can have a significant significant change in value of properties and again increase equity that way too. So another and multiple ways to increase the value of your property and therefore increase the equity. Now, obviously, the other alternatives we mentioned before to increasing value is to actually reduce the debt that you've got against the property to build equity that way. Now, in order to do that, you've typically got to be paying more down off your loan. Now, you may be able to do that if you perhaps receive a pay rise or some form of cash windfall, an inheritance of some sort, and that may enable you to pay down the loan as well and increase equity that way. But you may also be wanting to have those funds for other alternate uses. So one of the best ways to reduce debt on your property is via increasing your rental income that you're receiving on the property. So to increase that weekly income, you'll most not likely need to upgrade or improve the property that you've got on there in some form. So renovations are usually the best way to do this, and we've spoken about those earlier in the podcast. However, the way to increase capital value is not always the same, and they don't always go hand in hand in terms of increasing the rental return. So it's important to understand what your property may lack from a renter's perspective and what they may be looking for, and therefore be prepared to pay more for from a rental point of view. So we tend to find that renters really value and focus on service areas, kitchens and bathrooms. So being able to increase or improve those can really help. That doesn't necessarily mean full-blooded renovations. You can improve the aspect or the quality of a kitchen and a bathroom without having to rip out and gut the whole place. So over time, we've looked at there's some great painting products to paint tiles, so those that have become dated to bring them back to a neutral white. To change taps, both bath, shower and hand basin can make a big difference as well. And even changing shower screens can make a big difference. And all of a sudden you've got what feels to be a brand new bathroom without the full expense of having to do the full-blooded renovation. So these are things that you can look at and consider doing. Heating and cooling as well are not necessarily things that are going to significantly increase the capital value of the property, but renters will certainly look upon that favourably. So if there's no air conditioning, for instance, in a property, putting in a split system air conditioner can significantly, well, not significantly, but it could increase your rental income by $10 or $20 a week, which obviously when we're looking at trying to gain every avenue we can to pay down debt, that can certainly be of help as well. So there are ways and means, but it's important to understand the difference of when you're focusing on a rental return or increasing a rental return, what is the renter going to be looking for with your property? Okay, so let's have a look at, I'll have a chat about now the case study for this week. So we were recently approached by a client of ours who owned a two-bedroom apartment that we'd purchased for them many, many years ago within a block of 4 apartments. They expressed that they, along with the other owners within that block, were interested in selling their development as a whole rather than as individuals. Now, we looked at it, took a step back. Each individual apartment on a really good day was probably worth about $1 million each at best. But the site itself was highly undercapitalised because four apartments on a site of in excess of 1,000 square metres in the location of this property meant that the land value was enormous for this property. There was not much else like it around, and by coming together, they were going to be in a far better position. Now, harder to build equity in this instance to borrow against, but when it comes to actually selling, then it can work very much in your favour. So we had an independent valuation assessment done on this property, which suggested the property was worth $7 million as a whole, so already significantly above what the sum of the parts would be. But in the end, after a very successful campaign, it ended up selling for close to $10 million. So by coming together, that equity was enormous, and the profit that they were able to make was a significant difference compared to doing it on your own. So that's about it for today's podcast. As I mentioned last week, we are looking to do the question and opinion podcast in a few weeks' time, and we've had many questions come in over the last fortnight, so please keep those coming in. Send them to podcast@wakeland.com.au so we can really get into some good quality questions in a few weeks' time. But thanks for joining me for episode 40. Please, as always, feel free to share the podcast far and wide with friends, family, colleagues, and anyone else who might be interested in property. And for further information, have a look at the website, wakeland.com.au, and we obviously wish you all the best with your property decisions.